Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 7. We're coming down the home stretch. Just 4 weeks left, counting this week. So, um, definitely moving right through. As you can see, I'm recording this week from the nursery. We've got the fish mobile over here. Uh, got the Mickey Mouse stained glass here. So yeah, not recording from a sort of professional studio today. Recording from the nursery. Okay, a few announcements. Midterm was last week. I have not graded your short essay questions yet, but I will be grading them this week. Most likely, I will just wait until I've graded all of them, and then I will unmute the assignment so the grades will show up in the grade book. And I'll send out an email um, when I do that. Hopefully, the midterm wasn't too challenging. It should have been, it was. Primarily taken a lot of the true false multiple choice were taken from the quizzes, and the short essay questions were based upon the things I asked you guys to look at in that midterm study guide. So hopefully everybody felt pretty good about that. We only have 2 assignments left. We've got quiz 4 in a couple weeks, and then after that, your final proposal's due, and that's essentially all we've got left. So you guys are um, almost done with the assignments, right? Besides sort of the weekly participation assignments and things like that. So we're definitely wrapping things up. Hopefully, you guys are starting, as I suggested, starting to work on, your proposals. Don't wait until the last minute to do it. Try to, maybe take 15, 30 minutes a day, work on a section here, work on a section there. And hopefully you're seeing as we're going through um, these different sections, like last week on the purpose statement. That's a perfect template for you for writing the purpose statement for your final proposal. So hopefully we're just sort of going through step by step, and that's helpful. Okay, so last week we read the chapter on the purpose statement, which Creswell claims is the most important statement in the entire research proposal. Which is why I guess he devotes an entire chapter to one statement essentially. But the idea behind that is that a reader should be able to read the purpose statement of your proposal and know what it is that you're interested in doing, and what what your intentions are and what you expect to find out regarding those particular intentions. So this is sort of like your mission statement, right? This is where you say, this is what I'm going to do, right? And he talks about distinguishing it, it's a useful way of thinking about it, between the research problem, the research questions, and the purpose statement. So if you think about it, it kind of starts with the research problem, right? So, for instance, perhaps the research problem is the high rates of suicide among female veterans. That's the problem. We talk about the problem, we set it up, we say, here's the background, here's what the current studies say, here's what the recent literature says. And then, sort of what comes next, although it doesn't necessarily come next in all proposals, but logically speaking, what comes next would be the purpose statement. Okay, so we have this problem of elevated suicide rates among female veterans. The purpose of my study will be to understand what are the contributing factors to these high rates of suicide among female veterans. Or maybe I even want to be more specific, and I want to say the purpose of my study will be to understand how level of education among female veterans affects their elevated suicide rates, or does the level of education actually play a role, right? And maybe I do that by, looking at officers versus enlisted veterans and see if that plays a part. But that's the intent of my study. I want to know about this particular aspect, and then I want to sort of depending upon whether I have a qualitative or a quantitative or even a mixed method study, I'm going to approach it slightly differently. If I'm doing a qualitative, I'll be exploring maybe a particular concept of military sexual trauma, maybe I want to know if sort of survivors of military sexual trauma have a greater likelihood of committing suicide. So that would be the concept that I'm exploring, and I would talk about that in my purpose statement. If I were doing a quantitative study, it could be very similar to what I talked about earlier with sort of, is it the case that, lower levels of education among female veterans leads to an increased risk of suicide? In that case, the lower levels of education would be the independent variable, and, high risk of suicide would be the dependent variable. And then I could put in, my intervening and mediating variables that I need to control for in there as well. Okay, so yeah, so we have the problem. We have the high rates of suicide among female veterans. We have the intent of our study, which is to either maybe perhaps explore the phenomenon of military sexual trauma, or the relationship between levels of education and elevated risks of suicide. And then we get to the sort of the third part of the logic tree, which would be developing the research questions. So we have this problem. Our intent is to look at this particular aspect of it. Then once we know that, then we can sort of have an idea of what kind of questions we can develop to try to achieve our purpose, right? Our intent of undertaking the study, because depending upon which avenue we go is going to drive the questions that we're actually going to be looking at in our study. Okay, and then Creswell just sort of spends the rest of the chapter talking about what purpose statements look like for qualitative studies, quantitative studies, and mixed method studies. So, for instance, if you if you guys, you don't have to do it now, but at some point, definitely, if you're, depending upon which research design you're choosing, you're going to want to look at the templates that Creswell provides. For instance, for qualitative purpose statement on page 114, the top of page 114, he provides this template. And the template says that the purpose of this, and then he's got a blank for strategy of inquiry, which is like ethnography, case study. For instance, for me, it could be like for my dissertation, I did phenomenological research. So the purpose of this phenomenological study is to, and depending upon how we want to go, usually with phenomenology, you're trying to describe. You're describing a certain phenomenon from a individual's perspective. So the purpose of this phenomenology is to describe military sexual trauma. It says that's the central phenomenon being studied, just to describe military sexual trauma for female veterans. And then it says at whatever the research site is, right? So usually, usually with a qualitative study, you're studying people in their natural environment, right? You're not bringing them into a lab, into a controlled environment. So in this place, it could just be, the purpose of this phenomenological study is to describe military sexual trauma for female veterans in their communities, right, or at their homes. And then the last statement he puts in here: at this stage in the research, military sexual trauma will be generally defined as whatever, right? Just providing a general definition. You're not going to go into, and say this is the definition, because that's the purpose of your study, is to actually try to arrive at a better definition of what military sexual trauma actually looks like. So, and yet he does this for each one. But you can see here that in this qualitative thing, there are certain things that he highlights that are different from the quantitative. The major one being, you're focusing on this concept or phenomenon. In this case, the phenomenon is military sexual trauma, right? And he talks about strategy of inquiry, which also happens in the quantitative study. The purpose is going to be different, right? For qualitative, here it says understand, describe, develop, discover. Usually with quantitative, you're trying to explain or predict, right? So it's this language, even though he describes it as using action verbs, which predict and describe are both action verbs, but they're slightly different verbs depending upon the type of study. You identify your participants. what you're going to do in the quantitative as well. And then, the research site, which is also, it's more important in the qualitative study because, qualitative research just believes that things should be studied in their natural environment. By bringing somebody into a lab, you can actually change their behavior, right? So we want to study people in their their natural setting. You're providing a general definition of the concept in this qualitative purpose statement, whereas um, in quantitative, you would be providing a much more definitive definition that's usually derived from a particular individual's theory. So, and then also he talks about with qualitative statements, you want to make sure that you point out that the research is emerging, right, or your process is emergent, which just means that in a quantitative study, you very clearly delineate the steps that you're going to take to conduct your study. Whereas, because in a qualitative study, things are much more exploratory, you may find in the middle of your study that you actually need to adjust or change the methods that you're using. So you want to make that clear in the qualitative purpose statement that this is an emerging study. No one has really done that much work. Nobody has developed a theory that correlates military sexual trauma to elevated rates of suicide among female veterans. So, so in the qualitative, you're focusing on the phenomenon, you're talking about the participants, and you're talking about the site itself. Excuse me, and the emergent aspect, right? And in a quantitative study, remember, we're not looking at the central phenomenon as much. What we're interested in is the relationship between the variables, between the independent and dependent variable primarily. So let's see. Yeah. So things that are important, and for those who want to follow along in their books, page 118 is where Creswell has his template for quantitative study, and that essentially just follows along, and you're just plugging in the different aspects of the particular purpose statement that he has laid out there. Some of the things that are important to identify in the quantitative statement, of course, are the variables themselves is the most important thing. The relationship between the variables, right? So, and then he also talks about the importance of sort of placing the variables in like a type of logical continuum from left to right. A causes B, right? So you have independent variable comes first because that's the cause, and then you have the dependent variable, which is the the outcome or the effect. And then of course you have the intervening variables, if there are any, in your particular statement. And so if A and we're controlling for B, then C, right? Something along those lines. Let's see if there's anything else important to say about the quantitative statement. No, I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. He also talked, I mean, the strategy of inquiries in there, once again, in the beginning, talking about whether it's a survey or a natural experiment. And you see that it's the importance of the theory is actually, it's interesting to note that theory is not mentioned at all in the qualitative statement, but in the quantitative template, theory comes right at the beginning, right? And then he just sort of provides this discussion of the relationship between the independent, the dependent, and the sort of intervening variables in there. And then the last thing he looks at is the mixed methods template. He provides several templates depending upon whether you're doing sort of a sequential or concurrent or even a transformational mixed methods strategy. And those are on 122. And essentially, they're very similar to the qualitative and quantitative templates, but in this case, if you're doing a mixed method, you need to essentially describe or explain why you've chosen to use both quantitative and qualitative research to try to solve this particular problem or answer this particular question. And you also need to describe sort of what's the relationship between the qualitative and the quantitative data. Is one prior to the other? Are they both equally important, or are you trying to go beyond, sort of those both of those paradigms? So, yeah, I mean, pretty straightforward this week, right? This should be, like I say, this should be an excellent resource for you guys as you're writing your final proposal. For those that have been tuning in for the extra credit assignment, this is what we did last week. Was we actually had people try to use these templates to write a purpose statement for their research proposal. Hopefully that was helpful. You guys can go back if you haven't had a chance to do that last week. You can go in and do it this week. But as you'll see, I'm designing these extra credit assignments so that if you're doing them, when it comes time to actually turn in your proposal, you should be able to go to the stuff that you've been writing down in the extra credit assignments, essentially just start putting the puzzle pieces together, right? So you're, rather than doing it, all at one time, you can just, we're doing it sort of week by week, and then you can sort of plug things in and fill in the gaps and things like that. I think that's it for this week. I will post the discussion question and the extra credit on Wednesday. If you guys have any questions, put them on the course questions page. We don't have any assignments due this week, which is exciting. You guys have a couple weeks breather, but don't use that. Don't let that time go to waste.